I never thought I'd come home and find somebody else building a house on my property, but that's exactly what happened, and even now it still sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. I own about 5 acres outside a small rural town, the kind of place where you can sit on your porch at sunset and hear nothing except wind moving through the trees and maybe a tractor somewhere in the distance. That peace and privacy were the whole reason I bought the land years ago. My driveway runs down a long gravel lane that cuts through open fields before disappearing into a patch of hardwood trees where my house sits. For the longest time, the lot next to mine was completely empty. Nobody lived there, nobody farmed it, nobody even bothered to mow it. It was just tall grass, old fence posts, and a whole lot of nothing. Then about a year before all this happened, a couple named Travis and Nicole bought the property. At first, they seemed perfectly normal. We waved when we passed each other. We chatted once about a storm that had rolled through the area. Nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at the insanity that was waiting around the corner. A few months later, I started noticing construction flags and wooden stakes showing up near the property line. I figured they were preparing to build a house. That didn't concern me. People move out to the country specifically because there's room to build. I wished them luck and went on with my life. Then I left town for 10 days on a work assignment. It wasn't some dramatic departure. I locked the house, checked the mailbox, loaded my truck, and drove away. Everything was completely normal. Their lot was still mostly empty. My property looked exactly the way it always had, and there wasn't a single reason in the world to think I'd come home to a disaster. 10 days later, I turned onto my gravel road and immediately felt something was wrong. You know those moments when your brain notices a problem before you consciously understand what it is? That's exactly what happened. The first thing I saw were tire tracks. Huge ones. Heavy equipment had clearly been driving all over the area. Then I noticed piles of dirt near the edge of my field. My stomach tightened. As I drove farther down the road, the scene came into focus, and that's when I slammed on the brakes. Sitting there, partially hidden by construction materials, was a concrete foundation. A massive one. At first, I actually thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I parked the truck, got out, and just stared. Wooden forms were still attached around parts of the concrete. Steel rebar was sticking up into the air. The foundation had obviously been poured recently. Somebody was getting ready to build a house. The only problem was that they were building it on my land. I walked back to my truck, grabbed my survey documents, and headed toward the property markers I had installed years earlier. I checked one marker, then another, then another. Every single one matched the survey. There was no confusion. There was no gray area. The concrete slab wasn't close to the property line. It wasn't barely crossing it. It was several feet inside my property. I remember standing there laughing because the situation was so absurd that my brain almost refused to accept it. Who build a foundation without verifying where their land actually ends? But the laughter disappeared pretty quickly when reality sank in. This wasn't a misplaced garden shed. This wasn't a fence panel leaning over the line. This was the beginning of an entire house. I called Travis immediately. "Hey," I said, doing my best to stay calm. "I think you've got a serious problem. That foundation you poured is on my property." There was silence for a second. Then he sounded confused. "No way," he said. "Our builder measured everything." I explained that I had an official survey and permanent property markers. He started sounding irritated. "Well, our contractor said it's fine." That was the first moment I realized this might not be a simple misunderstanding. Most reasonable people would hear the words, "Your foundation is on my property," and immediately stop construction until things got sorted out. Instead, Travis sounded defensive, almost annoyed that I had brought it up. Eventually, he said he'd talk to the builder and call me back. I said fine and hung up. Then I waited. 1 day passed. Nothing. 2 days passed. Still nothing. Meanwhile, workers returned to the site. Lumber started arriving. Stacks of framing materials appeared next to the foundation. It looked like they were preparing to build walls. That's when the situation stopped being a mistake and started feeling like a deliberate gamble. Somebody was betting that I'd back down, ignore it, or agree to some compromise after the fact. Standing there watching another delivery truck unload materials onto a foundation that sat squarely inside my property line, I realized this wasn't going away on its own. If anything, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Now let me pause the story for a second, because this is where a lot of people make the same mistake Travis and Nicole made. They assumed that because a contractor said everything was fine, they were protected. According to standard procedure, that's not how property rights work. The responsibility ultimately falls on the property owner, not just the builder they hired. From a legal perspective, once someone notifies you that a structure may be crossing a property boundary, the smart move is to stop construction immediately and verify the facts before spending another dollar. But here's where things get interesting. This is a psychological trap that catches people all the time. The more money people invest into a project, the harder it becomes for them to admit they might be wrong. Instead of stopping and reassessing, they double down because admitting a mistake feels more painful than risking a bigger loss later. I've seen it happen in business, relationships, and property disputes. People become emotionally attached to a decision and start defending it long after the evidence says they shouldn't. Unfortunately for my neighbors, that exact mindset was about to turn a bad situation into an extremely expensive one. After realizing they had no intention of stopping construction, I decided it was time to stop treating the situation like a neighborly disagreement and start treating it like the legal problem it had become. I contacted a property attorney named Daniel Mercer, a guy with a reputation for being calm, methodical, and almost impossible to rattle. I brought him every document I had, including the original survey from when I purchased the property years earlier. He spent less than 10 minutes looking through the paperwork before leaning back in his chair and saying, "I think you're right, but if this ends up in court, we don't want opinions. We want certainty." That made sense to me. So instead of rushing into a fight, we ordered a brand new professional survey. For the next week, I watched construction materials continue to arrive while we waited for the results. Every delivery felt like gasoline being poured onto a fire. Piles of lumber grew larger. Pallets of supplies appeared beside the slab. At one point, I even saw workers unloading wall framing components. Nobody was actively building yet, but they were clearly preparing for the next phase. What made it worse was the complete silence from Travis. He had promised to call back. He never did. No explanation, no update, no attempt to work things out. Just silence. Then the survey results arrived. I still remember opening the packet in Daniel's office. The surveyor had marked every boundary point, every measurement, every structure. The conclusion was impossible to misinterpret. The entire foundation sat on my property. Not half of it, not a corner of it. The entire thing. Daniel looked at the paperwork and simply nodded. "Well," he said, "now we know." The next step was a certified legal notice. Daniel drafted a formal letter explaining the findings and outlining two options. Option 1, remove the foundation voluntarily. Option 2, refuse, and I would remove it myself and seek reimbursement for every expense. The letter was delivered. A few days later, their attorney responded. The response was fascinating because it contained an admission hidden inside a request. They described the situation as an honest mistake and asked whether I would consider selling them the affected portion of land or granting an easement that would allow them to keep the foundation where it was. In other words, they knew they had a problem. Now, they wanted me to solve it for them. Maybe some people would have accepted the offer. Maybe some landowners would have seen an opportunity to make money. But I couldn't get past the principle of it. The foundation was located near the area where I planned to build a workshop someday. More importantly, I didn't like the message it would send. Build first, ask permission later. Reward bad decisions. Create a precedent that boundaries only matter when they're convenient. So I told Daniel to reject the proposal. The answer was no. Clear, simple, final. What happened next convinced me I had made the right decision. Instead of correcting the mistake, they continued moving materials onto the site. It was like they believed reality would somehow change if they ignored it long enough. Daniel called me after hearing about another delivery. "They're taking a risk," he said, "a very expensive risk." Then he gave me the advice that changed everything. "If they won't remove it, you can." The plan took shape quickly. We hired a licensed demolition contractor. We coordinated with the survey company. We arranged documentation, photographs, measurements, reports, timelines, notices. Every step was recorded. Every conversation was documented. Every legal requirement was followed exactly. According to standard procedure, when property disputes reach this point, documentation becomes your best friend. Emotion doesn't matter. Evidence does. The demolition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I'll never forget waking up that day. There was a strange calmness to it. No anger, no excitement, just certainty. By then the neighbors had been warned multiple times. They had been given opportunities to fix the problem themselves. They had chosen not to. Around 8 o'clock the convoy arrived. First came the surveyor, then Daniel, then the demolition crew. Finally, an excavator rolled down the gravel road, followed by a dump truck and a concrete breaking attachment. The sight was almost surreal. Just a few weeks earlier, there had been an unauthorized foundation sitting on my property. Now there was a small army of professionals preparing to erase it. Before any work began, Daniel sent one final notice, one last chance, one last opportunity to respond. Nothing. No phone call. No appearance. No objection. Silence. By late morning, the crew received authorization to proceed. The excavator moved into position. The operator lowered the breaker attachment onto the concrete. Then came the first impact. Crack. The sound echoed across the field. Another strike followed. Then another. Hairline fractures spread across the slab like lightning. Within minutes, large sections began breaking apart. Rebar twisted out of the concrete as chunks were lifted into the air. Dust filled the sunlight. The entire process felt strangely symbolic. Every crack represented a bad decision that should have been corrected weeks earlier. The crew worked methodically throughout the day. Broken concrete was loaded into trucks and hauled away. Steel reinforcement bars were removed. Debris disappeared piece by piece. By afternoon, what had once been a foundation looked more like an excavation site. By evening, it was gone, completely gone. If someone had driven past without knowing the story, they never would have guessed a house foundation had existed there at all. I stood near the property line as the last truck pulled away. The land was quiet again. The trees moved gently in the breeze. For the first time in weeks, the tension was gone. Or so I thought. The following afternoon, a pickup truck came flying down the gravel road. Travis jumped out before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Nicole followed behind him. Both looked absolutely furious. "What the hell did you do?" Travis shouted. "You destroyed our foundation." I remember being struck by the wording. Not your foundation. Not the foundation. Our foundation. As if ownership somehow changed because they'd spent money on it. They threatened lawsuits. They accused me of sabotage. They claimed I had caused enormous financial damage. The entire time, I stayed calm. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't trade insults. Instead, I handed them copies of both surveys, copies of the certified notices, copies of the attorney correspondence, and documentation showing every opportunity they had been given to avoid this outcome. The anger on their faces slowly shifted into something else. Not acceptance, not understanding, something closer to realization. Deep down, they knew exactly what had happened. The months that followed were consumed by legal proceedings. Predictably, they filed claims. Equally predictably, those claims began collapsing once the evidence was examined. From a legal perspective, property boundaries are not suggestions. They are enforceable rights. Survey data, notices, documentation, expert testimony, photographs, and timelines all pointed in the same direction. The facts were overwhelming. Eventually, the court issued its ruling. The construction had been entirely on my property. I had the legal right to protect that property. The demolition was lawful. The notices had been sufficient. The opportunities to correct the mistake had been reasonable. Most importantly, the financial responsibility belonged to the people who created the problem in the first place. The final judgment required Travis and Nicole to cover the demolition costs, the surveys, and my legal expenses. In the end, the very gamble they had hoped would pressure me into a compromise ended up costing them far more than fixing the mistake would have cost in the beginning. The irony was almost unbelievable. After everything was over, they still built their house. The difference was at this time, they built it on their own land. exactly where it should have been from the start. When everything was finally over and the lawyers stopped calling, the survey crews disappeared, and the court documents were filed away, I found myself standing in that same field one evening watching the sun drop behind the trees. The spot where the foundation had once been looked completely ordinary again. Grass had already started growing back. The tire tracks were fading. Nature has a funny way of reclaiming things and reminding us that most human drama is temporary. Looking back, the strangest part of the entire experience wasn't the foundation itself. It wasn't the demolition equipment. It wasn't even the courtroom. The strangest part was how many chances there were to avoid the outcome. At almost every stage, somebody could have made a different decision. The builder could have double-checked the survey. The neighbors could have paused construction when I first called. They could have stopped after receiving the first legal notice. They could have corrected the mistake before investing more money. Instead, every decision pushed them deeper into the same hole. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in life. People become so committed to proving they were right that they stop paying attention to reality. The more they invest, the harder it becomes to walk away. Pride starts making decisions instead of common sense. I've seen it in businesses that keep funding failing projects, in people who stay in arguments they already lost, and apparently in property owners who keep building on land that doesn't belong to them. The lesson here is not really about concrete, surveys, or even legal disputes. The lesson here is about what happens when ego gets involved. Most expensive mistakes don't start with bad intentions. They start with small decisions that people refuse to correct because admitting an error feels uncomfortable. According to standard procedure, property boundaries exist for a reason. They protect everyone involved. They're not obstacles. They're guidelines that allow neighbors to coexist without constant conflict. Once those boundaries are ignored, everything becomes harder, more expensive, and far more stressful than it needs to be. From a legal perspective, ownership means something. It isn't determined by who spent the most money. It isn't determined by who worked the hardest. It isn't determined by who gets emotionally attached to a project. It is determined by documented rights, surveys, and established boundaries. That's why courts rely on evidence instead of feelings. If they didn't, every property dispute would turn into a competition over who could yell the loudest. I also learned something important about staying calm. Throughout the entire ordeal, people kept asking why I didn't scream, threaten, or lose my temper. The truth is simple. Anger rarely improves your position. Documentation does. Patience does. Preparation does. Every time I felt frustrated, I reminded myself that facts were on my side. The louder the other side became, the more valuable it was to remain calm and let the evidence speak for itself. And honestly, there was something almost poetic about the ending. They eventually got their house. I kept my property. The boundaries were respected. Justice worked the way it was supposed to work. Nobody won because they were louder. Nobody won because they were stubborn. The facts won. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have sold them the piece of land and avoided the fight? Or would you have done exactly what I did and refused to compromise after someone built first and asked permission later? Let me know down in the comments, because this is one of those situations where people usually have very strong opinions. And trust me, after living through it, I can see both sides of the debate, but I still sleep pretty well knowing the workshop I plan to build someday will be sitting exactly where it's supposed to be on my land.